Hello and welcome to another level 3 5-minute video. In this session we're going to be talking about print defects. We're just going to highlight 6 of the most basic print defects. So we're going to be talking about misregister, dot gain or dot loss from the gravure printing process, feathering, picking, bullseyes, and finally gloss problems. So we'll go through this one by one. Misregister. If you look at these pictures here, this one is fairly blurred, that one is nice and crisp and clear. This is because each colour is put down as a separate image, and if the layers do not align correctly, then you will get this sort of fuzzy image. So it's usually because the sheet has moved because of the moisture that's applied. The moisture applied, the sheet will expand a little bit. It won't be in exactly the right place when it gets to the next colour station. So this is obviously an offset printing process, and useful for things up to 35,000 images per hour. Dot loss or dot gain, one of the gravure processes. If we deal with dot loss first, there's an example of dot loss. This is because the sheet is too rough. When the printing plate comes in contact with the paper, you want a good seal around each of those recesses, and then the paper will suck out the ink. If the paper is too rough, you won't get to suck out the ink, so it will stay in the gravure form. Dot gain is an unusual one. It doesn't mean there are more dots there than there should be. What it actually means is the dots are a little larger than they should be. So you've got the right number of dots, you've got all the dots there, but they've all got a bit bigger than they should be. If they've got a bit bigger than they should be, that's because they've spread out more, and there's 2 reasons why they could have spread out more. Either there's not enough sizing agent in the paper, and therefore it will spread out, or it could be that the printer has done something wrong. Either he's put too much solvent in his ink, or maybe the temperature in his workshop's too high, and that reduces the viscosity of the ink, and therefore the ink is a bit too runny, and so it spreads out a little more than it should have done. Feathering, we can see an example of feathering here. Feathering is where, when you write with perhaps an old-fashioned pen, you don't get a beautiful smooth line. You see these edges where the ink wicks out along the surface of the fibres. So this is entirely the paper maker's fault. They've not put enough sizing agent in the sheet. Picking. Now there's different types of picking. You've got vessel picking, wet picks and dry picks. And these are all problems from the offset printing process. This is an example of vessel picking. If you go back to your knowledge of fibres, we talked about softwood fibres are long and wide with little holes like windows in the surface of the fibre, and we said hardwoods, short and narrow, always accompanied by vessel cells. Well, those vessel cells have no bonding ability like cellulose does. So there's an example of the surface of a sheet, and you can see some of those vessel cells in it sitting there on the surface of the sheet. When the printing form comes, and this is printing red ink, and then lifts up, the vessel cell that has no attraction for this cellulose will get pulled out, and it will stay on the surface of the printing form, and therefore you will have a space where the vessel cell was, because the ink didn't get there. It's on the vessel cell, and there's the vessel cell that we pulled out of it. That will be on the printing form. And then we've got pick. As the roll goes around and the sheet goes through, then the ink is deposited on the surface of the paper, and then the ink film splits. Some of the ink film stays on the paper, some of the ink film will stay on the surface of the printing cylinder, and it takes a certain amount of force to split that ink film into 2. Well, if the force needed to do that is greater than the strength of the surface of the sheet, then rather than the ink film splitting, it will actually rip out some of the surface of the sheet. And if it does that on the very first image that we ever lay down, where the sheet is perfectly dry. That's what we call dry pick. And these are some test samples from the dry pick test. So you can see it started at this end and it's gone faster and faster and faster, and you see tiny little bits of coating pick there, and then it's really ripped it there. And that's about the same as that one, and that one is a lot more severe. With the offset printing process, we always put down ink in the image area and water everywhere else. So after the first station, the paper has always been wet at least once. So we have another thing that we measure called wet pick. So this is the strength of the coating where the surface has been wetted previously. So what we do is we run a water wheel down the middle of the test strip, putting a little bit of moisture on, and then we carry out the pick test. And you can see where there was no moisture, the coating is very strong and we get good ink transfer. Where we had that moisture, it's weakened the surface, and therefore we're picking out lumps of the surface. So that's wet pick. Bullseyes is another printing problem. You can recognise a bullseye. You've normally got a dark spot in the middle with a surround that's very much paler, and then you've got your normal printed image. So a coloured spot surrounded by the unprinted area. The dot is due to debris. So what's happened is some debris from somewhere has gone onto your printing blanket. The printing blanket has then come into contact with the sheet, but where that bit of debris was, it's prevented the printing blanket coming into complete contact with the sheet, and therefore around that you've got an area where the ink never actually quite got there. So it's due to debris. And where does the debris come from? Usually from chopped edges or slit edges of your paper. So when the paper's being cut into sheets, or when it's being slit down into narrower widths, if the knives are not sharp enough, or if they're not quite set correctly, it won't cut the sheet, it will tear the sheet. That will create a bit of debris. That can get caught onto the sheet then by electrostatic attraction, and it will come off onto the printing blanket and cause you bullseyes. Gloss, we're really talking about ink gloss here. So if you print on a paper with some ink and you expect to get a certain level of gloss, if you don't get that level of gloss, why? Well, one reason could be that the coating on the surface of the sheet is too thin, and therefore the ink went through the coating and soaked into the paper, so it's not there sat out on top. It could be that the printer made a problem and the ink was not viscous enough, so it was too runny, either because there was too much solvent in there or the workshop temperature was too high. That again will cause the ink to penetrate beyond the surface. It won't sit proud on the surface where you want it. It will soak into the surface, so it won't be on the top to give you the gloss. It could be if you've got a coated sheet of paper that the base sheet wasn't sized well enough. If the base sheet wasn't sized well enough, then the binder in the coating mix will soak through into the paper. That will leave insufficient binder on the top, so there'll be more pigment to binder ratio than there should be. The ink will come in then and it will go under the particles of pigment, and therefore again you will lose gloss. Or it could simply be that the ink drying rate was too low, and that will also give you gloss problems. Okay, so a quick summary of what we've talked about. 3 points to raise. Poor sizing of a sheet can result in things like sheet movement, it can result in dot gain, it can result in feathering, or it can result in binder migration. If the sheet's too rough, you will get dot loss because in the gravure process. And finally, if the printer's ink is too runny or not viscous enough, then you can get problems like dot gain or poor ink gloss. Okay, well that's the end of this session. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to follow up. Oh, sorry, there's another one there. You can have debris in the sheet. Debris on the sheet will either cause picking problems or it will cause bullseyes. I'll try again. Thank you for listening to this video, and please feel free to follow us on any of this social media.